Hello and welcome to this first lesson in Azure Virtual Networks. And during this lesson, we're going to answer the question, what is an Azure Virtual Network? So before we start diving into it, I need to make a statement about the classic Azure portal versus the new Azure portal, which is also called the Azure Resource Manager, or ARM. I'm not going to get into a lot of details on this. You just need to know that in all of the examples in this lessons, in all of these lessons, we will be using the Azure Resource Manager to do it. So what is an Azure Virtual Network? Well, an Azure Virtual Network enables Azure resources to communicate with each other and the internet. A virtual network isolates your resources from other resources in the Azure cloud, and you can connect networks to other virtual networks and to your on-premise network. So what are the capabilities? Well, we're going to go into these in detail, and they are isolation, internet communication, Azure resource communication, virtual network connectivity, on-premise connectivity, traffic filtering, and routing. Can I do all this in 10 minutes? Let's go. Network isolation and segmentation. So your networks are isolated from each other. You can create separate virtual networks for different types of deployments and testing and production, and they can use the same address spaces if needed. You can create multiple virtual networks and then connect those to other networks. You can segment your virtual network into multiple subnets. Azure provides the internal name resolution sources for you, so you don't have to deploy any DNS, but you can bring your own DNS in if it's needed. For internet communications, by default, resources such as virtual machines deployed in a virtual network have access to the internet. You can also enable inbound access for specific resources as needed. Azure Resource Communication. So Azure resources deployed in a virtual network can communicate with each other using private IP addresses, even if those resources are deployed in separate subnets. This is a big thing, right? So Azure provides default routing between subnets connected to virtual networks and on-premise networks, so you don't have to do any configuration of any routing or anything like that. You can, if you want, you can customize Azure's routing, but it's pretty cool that it just comes and works straight out of the box. Virtual networking connectivity. So virtual networks can be connected to other virtual networks, enabling resources in other virtual networks to communicate with resources in other virtual networks. So you can literally chain them all together if that's your desire. On-premise connectivity. So you can connect your virtual network to an on-premise data center or to an on-premise network. And there are 3 ways that you can accomplish this. You can do a point-to-site VPN, you can do a site-to-site VPN, or you can use what's called an Azure Express route. Let's talk a little bit about traffic filtering. You can filter network traffic to and from resources in virtual networks by source IP and port, by destination address and port and protocol. Really the same way that you would do it in an on-premise network or with a firewall. And finally, we have routing. So routing is optional. You can optionally override Azure's routing, as we had mentioned before. You can configure your own routes, or you can propagate BGP routes through a network gateway. Then we've got IP addresses, and we're going to talk about IP addresses and the different types of IP addresses and the different ways that they're allocated. So there are 2 types of IP addresses. Same as there are with on-premise networking, there's public IP addresses and private IP addresses. Public IP addresses are ones that are routable on the internet. In Azure Resource Manager, a public IP address is a resource that has its own properties. And some of the things that would require a public IP address are virtual machine network interfaces, internet-facing load balancers, VPN gateways, and application gateways. Then there are private IP addresses, and these IP addresses are reserved and they're non-routable on the internet. In Azure Resource Management Deployment Model, a private IP address is associated with the following types of resources: virtual machine networks, interfaces, internal load balancers, and application gateways. Let's talk about the different types of IP allocations. There's dynamic, which means that the address is automatically assigned to your VM or to your Azure resource when it starts up. And there's static, which is where you assign an IP address to that particular resource and you don't want it to change. And finally, there's DHCP. And DHCP is controlled by Azure. And for those of you that want to try to set up a DHCP on an Azure virtual machine, you're going to be very surprised when you realize that role is not made available to you. Now, keep in mind, the IP address leases is for the lifetime of the virtual machine until you restart it, stop it, or deallocate the VM. So when you restart your VM, odds are you're going to get a different IP address unless you have assigned that as a static IP. And lastly, we have Azure Provided Name Resolution, or DNS. Azure provides internal name resolution for VMs and role instances that reside in the same virtual network or cloud services. VMs or instances in a cloud service share the same DNS suffix. DNS names can be assigned to both NICs and to VMs. And you can also roll your own DNS if there's required. And there are several use cases where you would have to have your own DNS server, especially when you're connecting to an on-premise network.